Welcome, my friends, and thanks for joining me today. I'm Lorna Schumann with the Illinois State Museum, and today we're going to talk about the original people that called Illinois their home. And here's the thing, generally when we talk about the first people who lived here, we probably, and you have probably heard this, that we refer to them a few different ways, either as Native Americans, American Indians, or First Nation people, or indigenous. And that mainly means people who lived here first, or were here originally upon the land. And we're going to look at how these groups changed over time. And in order to do that, we need to understand that there were archaeologists. That's how we know some of our information. And archaeologists are basically people who study groups of people that lived long ago by using the evidence, like their objects and the big pieces that we can't move behind, in order to understand how people lived long ago. And that's generally without written documentation. So we're going to look at how Native people's lives changed over hundreds of years. And to start that, we're going to step back in time about 1,000 years ago, which is really a long time ago, and see what we can learn. Now that we step back 1,000 years, I want to introduce you to the largest, earliest city in Illinois. It was called Cahokia. At least that's what we call it today. But we don't know what they called Cahokia 1,000 years ago. Cahokia was one of the largest cities in what was now the United States and Canada. It was the biggest one around, and in fact it was larger than some European cities like London, England, at the same time. Kind of hard to imagine. There were 20,000 people or more living in Cahokia. Well, how big is 20,000? If I take my hand and I hold it up, and each of my fingers represents part of the number of people that live in the town I'm in, which is Springfield, which is 100,000 plus people. And I try and show you how big Cahokia was to Springfield. Cahokia would have been one finger. That's it. But still a lot of people for that time period 1,000 years ago. So now, let's look at what we think Cahokia looked like. This is a map of Cahokia. And in fact, one of the first features you notice is this right here. This is Monk's Mound. It's a large piece of earthen buildings. That means dirt piled on top of each other to create a big stand or hill. And in fact, Cahokia was part of a larger group of people that we refer to as the Mississippian peoples or the Mounds Builders. They were found throughout the Midwest and down into the Southeast at one time. But Cahokia was the largest piece of it. We don't know exactly what these groups of people called themselves, but that's what we called them. What they do have in common together is they had large mounds in their cities, and they were found by towns. So now let's look at this. If we look here at Monk's Mound, we can see and we know that it's 100 feet tall. That's 10-story buildings, okay? So 10 stories piled on top. In fact, maybe you visited there and even walked up the stairs. Now, you see this around the edge? That is a fence surrounding Cahokia. And if you look and see those little tiny dots, both inside the fence and outside the fence, those are individual houses. What we do know about Cahokia is they were farmers. And in fact, they ate some of the same foods that we eat today. And one of those foods is a very important crop or plant we grow for us to eat here in Illinois. Have any idea what that might be? Did you guess corn? Great job. Yes, corn. We are the second most producer or grower of corn in the United States. And that's pretty cool. Corn originally came from Mexico, hundreds of years before Cahokia, and the seeds were used by people throughout the United States to grow. And at Cahokia, they grew large fields of corn, not the same way we grow corn today. Another plant that they grew that you probably know is pumpkins. Pumpkins were grown here in the United States 2,000 years before Cahokia. So that's a long time ago. And in fact, cool thing to know about Illinois, we're the #1 grower or producer of pumpkins in the U.S. That means we grow more pumpkins than any other place in the United States. So what are some of the other things we might have seen at Cahokia besides the big mounds? Well, I have a couple of pieces of pottery that I can share with you. These are not original, they're copies of what they would have made at Cahokia. The first one is a beaker pot. So you can see it goes in here is the cup. There's a little pouring spout. There's a handle right here. This was actually a drinking cup or for drinking liquids or for making medicines, much like our cup that we have today. Another type of pot that you can find at Cahokia is this. This is a beaver pot. It's a special type of pot, and you can see right here that we have the beaver's face, and you see this right through here. This is the stick he's carrying, and at the very back we can see his big tail, okay, that would have slapped on the water. And so we have pots that look like this. This is from Cahokia in the Mississippian time period. So the people from Cahokia and other Mississippian people were made up of many different groups of people and tribes that came from many different places. Much like how the United States is made up of people from all over the world and other places and other states, we have people that live here that come from many different places. Well, Cahokia was like that too. People came from all over to Cahokia to trade. We don't know what happened to the people from Cahokia, but people left the towns and moved to other places. Cahokia was no longer the big city it had been, and many of today's native people or tribes came from the Mississippian people. After people left Cahokia, there was other groups of people that were here in Illinois, but we don't have much evidence or clues about who lived here until about the time the French first arrived. There were different groups of people that we refer to often as historic native people. And the diorama behind me is an artist's idea of how people lived based on the evidence or the clues left from objects, drawings, early written material, and oral stories that were told. These things were documented, so we have a fairly good idea of the things and objects they would have used. This here is a Kickapoo house, which is one of the tribes that lived in Illinois. There were many different tribes, and they referred to themselves as nations, much like we live in a nation called the United States. Native people were and are nations or tribes. They have their own government and own elected leaders. Just like we have a president of the United States, tribal governments have a chief or a chairperson. And some of the tribes that historically, when the French were here, would have been found in Illinois would have been the following groups. Maybe you've heard some of the names. Kickapoo, Peoria, Potawatomi, Miami, Ho-Chunk or Winnebago, Cahokia, Kaskaskia, Michigamia, Tamarora, the Sauk, Fox or Meskwaki, Odawa or Ottawa, and many others. Maybe some of those words you've heard or names of tribal groups you've heard before because maybe they're a name of a town or a street or a building or something else. It's not uncommon that people name buildings after other things that they know. These groups of people who lived here, these tribes, had foods, homes, tools, just like all people do throughout the world. And what happens is when people meet, they exchange or trade ideas, tools, foods, and dress. And so when we start to look at like the clothing that we see here on the Kickapoo woman, or over here on the gentleman, what we have is we see a combination of traditional dress, those are items that they had before, and trade items that they were trading with the French and the British through here. So now we're getting closer to our time period. About 200 years ago, Native people were forced and pushed out of the state of Illinois to other states like Kansas and Oklahoma. However, Native people still live here today. Chicago has one of the largest Native populations in the United States and has people representing or part of 117 different tribal groups. Native people are Americans and do many of the same things other Americans do. They live in homes, they drive cars, and they go to school. Well, now we're back to our time, and I hope that you've enjoyed stepping back in the past with me, and I hope you learned a little bit more about Native people who lived in Illinois, both the past and the present. Thank you for joining me.